Hello everyone. This is a video specifically on component one of um, film GCSE. I've done a few videos in the past, but this one is just sort of meant to be an overview for each of the components that my students have specifically studied. So that'll be Singing in the Rain, Grease, Whiplash, and then I'll be going over component two in some other videos later, because obviously component one is the first paper that you'll cover. So I just wanted to make sure that that was done before we get on to component two. Now, in terms of what you'll be answering is you'll have 5 questions essentially on paper one. You'll start off, question one will be a Singing in the Rain question. Question two will be a Grease question. Question three will be a comparison between those two films. Question four will be a series of much smaller questions that are related to film history. And if you haven't been given the film industry sort of handout or the film history handout, please make sure you see me, or if you need it, just send me a message and I'll sort it for you. And then question 5 is the Whiplash question, which is specialist writing. So I'll be starting off with Singing in the Rain today. So with Singing in the Rain, it's involved in 2 questions, question 1 and question 3. Okay. Now question 1 is obviously a Singing in the Rain focus, and question 3 is a comparison to Grease. So what I'll do is go over a few distinct areas before we get started. Now, one thing I want to address before I cover Singing in the Rain in general is that they could ask these areas for any film that you've covered. Okay, so they could ask about mise-en-scene, they could ask cinematography, they could ask sound and editing, and they could ask context. Now, they have asked things such as genre before on component 2, even though it's not necessarily for component 2, it's more for component 1. But on these sets of films, Singing in the Rain and Grease, genre is quite heavily referenced and quite heavily mentioned. So genre would be another area that you would need to cover for Singing in the Rain and Grease. Unlike component 2, which has like really specific areas that you need to focus on for each film, Singing in the Rain and Grease is very broad. So what goes into all of these areas? Well, mise-en-scène is obviously everything that you can see on screen. So that could be props, costume, setting, all of that goes into mise-en-scène. Cinematography is all about camera. So the use of lighting, the use of camera angles, camera movements, all of that goes into cinematography. Sound and editing, I've paired those two together because they tend to go together. Editing also goes with cinematography. So usually they'll ask you a specific editing area, and then for the 10 marker, they would ask you cinematography and editing. That is not me saying that they won't just ask you about editing. They could. It's cruel, but they could. Okay. Sound, obviously, for Singing in the Rain and Grease, it's very straightforward because they're musicals. So you can talk a lot about music and how it creates meaning in the film. And then obviously context would go into any of the films. So going back to Singing in the Rain. As I said, they could ask you anything about Singing in the Rain, as well as the general areas. They can also ask about genre. They're expecting an extended answer for both the 10 marker and the 20 marker comparison. So I usually say to mine, a 10 marker is about a page long. The 20 marker is longer than that. I wouldn't necessarily say just 2 pages. Write as much as you possibly can on the comparison because it's the biggest weighting on the paper. And when you discuss the film, you should be linking to key scenes and analysing it in depth. Don't rely on just saying general things about the film. Saying general things about the film will get you a lower mark because you're not being specific and you're not able to evidence it. It's the same way in English. If you start referencing a book but you didn't use any quotations, you don't have evidence to back up your points. So it's good to make sure that you've got enough analysis. Okay, so in terms of genre questions then, if you were asked a genre question, the usual thing to focus on would be genre conventions. So conventions are things you would typically find in a genre. So I tend to also refer to these conventions as tropes. So in class, you might hear me say, oh, this is a trope of horror, or this is a trope of musicals. They are conventions, okay? So, for example, you would find songs in a musical, okay? Songs are the genre convention, and musicals are the genre, okay? So what do we find in Singing in the Rain? Obviously, we find singing and dancing in Singing in the Rain, okay? Now, obviously, you can link this quite heavily to context. Singing and dancing being in the film is very typical of musicals, but it's also necessary to uplift the audience. This came out during a time where people were quite depressed, not necessarily on a global scale, but the Cold War was happening, which means that people weren't necessarily in the right frame of mind to be having hard-hitting drama films, for example. They liked, like the general audience liked films that were all singing and dancing. And obviously, musicals have been a staple of filmmaking ever since the advent of sound cinema. Yeah. Now, the other thing is fantasy style settings. And I don't mean that in like the Lord of the Rings sense, where you just see like the Shire in The Hobbit, for example, or something like that. This is more about the world means you need to suspend your disbelief. Okay. So in a fantasy world, people just randomly start singing. People will randomly start dancing in the street. They will start to, go off on a tangent. They'll say, "Oh, I don't want to sing about this," and then they'll start singing about it. Or "I don't want to talk," and then they start singing a song that starts with "I don't want to talk." Yeah. So those fantasy style settings suspend our disbelief. We're not meant to sit there and go, "Phew, this is unrealistic." It's meant to be a fantasy world where singing is sort of this acceptable notion. Romance and comedy comes into Singin' in the Ring quite heavily. So comedy is lent on quite heavily by characters such as Cosmo, and they create comical situations and they make light the situation of the silent film era transitioning into the talkies. And there are a lot of things that happen in the film which are quite funny that are also very realistic. For example, when they're trying to fit Lena with a microphone, that always happened back in the day when they were starting to come up with how to incorporate sound into cinema. Okay. And they had people who were around at the time who advised on the film that also knew all about this. Okay, another thing is big set pieces. Like, you want a big set piece for musicals. You want to make it quite a spectacle. Not only are you focusing on the singing and dancing of the crew and the cast members, but you're looking at big set pieces, things that are going to strike attention to you, or even more over the top, lavish set pieces for Singin' in the Rain. Okay, now the last thing I'll put here is that songs that don't contribute to the story, and in a way that there's the songs in Singin' in the Rain are just sort of mishmash, and there's a reason for that. The songs were written first, and the film was written around those songs. These are songs from the 1920s, which were adapted for use in the 1950s, okay? That means that you can't really call Singin' in the Rain an integrated musical. There are definitely integrated songs within Singin' in the Rain. So, for example, You Were Meant for Me is an integrated song, because it's about them falling in love and finding each other. But there are several songs that do not contribute at all, and sometimes are just making contextual reference to the time. So, for example, when they're going through diction classes and they're having to pronounce words, when they do the alphabet song, the A song, that doesn't really contribute to the story. It makes reference to context, but it doesn't contribute to the story. Okay, moving on then. Mise en scène. Now, in Singin' in the Rain, there's a few things that you could cover. This is not an exhaustive list. There's lots of different mise en scène, but I've given you 3 different things you could focus on. Okay, costume, for example, it's typical of 1920s Hollywood. It's like Don rolling up his sleeves is meant to show this idea of new masculinity, about him showing off his figure. And when he dances, it's a bit like Fred Astaire in terms of how he leaps across the stage, and it's very much a throwback to those early musical films, which focused on the dancing. Props, so the use of behind the scenes equipment, such as the lighting and the fans when during the You Were Meant for Me sequence, it shows the movie making process and adds to the magic of the behind the scenes. It's a film about making a film, yeah? So it's sort of quite a parody in a sense, but also the props allow us to see those behind the scenes and allow us to link props to context. And setting. So you've got things like movie sets, houses, environments that replicate 1920s life. So you have the traditional costume and outfits. You have the lavish environments of Hollywood of the 1920s. All of these things add to the musical element of Singin' in the Rain, but also how lavish it's meant to be. Okay. Cinematography. There's lots of different things that you could make reference to here. Lighting and colour. Now, colour can fall into mise en scène as well. For example, if you have a red object or a red item of clothing, that falls into mise en scène. Now, lighting and colour tend to go hand in hand. So in You Were Meant for Me, there's heavy pink and purple tones in terms of colour. There's like sort of high key lighting to show an environment and show off the dancing of the cast and so on. Movements, there's lots of fluid movements to show dancing and display the actors. When we get onto editing, I'll make reference to the fact that there's a lack of cutting. There's a lot of long takes, which allow you to take in the spectacle of dancing and also display the actors and show them off. Angles as well, the use of long shots to observe dancing and set pieces, and also the use of close-ups to show emotion and love. So when Danny and, sorry, Dan, getting confused with Grease now. When Don and Kathy are falling in love, there's heavy use of close-ups to show the emotions of Kathy and how she's falling in love with Don, combined with the color and lighting that we saw earlier. Okay, now in terms of editing and sound, it's easy to do sound here. You've got songs that create meaning in some sequences, but sometimes are used just for fun or just to fill time. They don't necessarily have a place, all of them. The use of dialogue as well, it reflects the time and develops character. It's very PC. They don't really address anything that's particularly risky like they do in Grease. And that is because of the Hays Code, of course. Hays Code was in effect. And when we get onto context, we'll talk a little bit about the Hays Code. In terms of shot, reverse shot then for editing, this is where you look at one character, look back at whatever they're looking at, whether it's another character or somebody else or something else, and then you look back at that character. This is also known as the Kuleshov effect, and it's something that you'll cover a little bit more at A level, but it's the shot, reverse shot shows the passage of time and allows to see character reactions. And then finally, continuity editing is the idea of editing to keep in order. Most films you cover will have continuity editing, where you're just linking from scene to scene to scene to scene. And later on, when we go into Grease, I'll talk a little bit about cross-cutting, which is another type of editing that's used frequently. And then in terms of context questions, then if you're asked about context on Singin' in the Rain, there's a few things you could talk about. Firstly is the Hays Code. By the time Grease came out, Hays Code was abolished, but the Hays Code was in effect during Singin' in the Rain, which meant that a lot of the things that they do in the film had to be sort of PC and above board. They couldn't talk about any controversial issues. They had to keep it quite uplifting and quite generic and quite happy. In the silent, this also links to the silent film era. So the film is from the 1950s, but is set in the 1920s, okay? So it accurately portrays what was happening. And if you look a few bullet points down, it says the transition to talkies. It accurately portrays what it was like transitioning into talkies. Also, though, you see the 1950s values and how they valued the nostalgia for the 1920s. They had a lot of nostalgia for that time period, and they wanted to look back quite fondly. And this film, Singin' in the Rain, is meant to look back fondly on that silent film era and show its transition in sort of a positive and quite fun way. Okay. Now, you've also got the elements of musical history. So musical history being how musicals have evolved over time and what their intended purpose was for audiences and why audiences love them so much. Then you've got the integrated versus the non-integrated musicals. This is more for when you talk about a comparison between the two, because Grease is an integrated musical, and arguably you could say Singin' in the Rain isn't, because it only has a few integrated songs. And you could also talk on context questions about the war/post-war. So obviously the war being World War II, and then you've got that going into the Cold War while Singin' in the Rain was out, and how that may have affected the audience and may have affected why the film was so popular and came out at that time. Okay. Now, in terms of my key scenes, I'm not going to play them, obviously, but You Were Meant for Me is one of the biggest key scenes and one of the most important ones for you to analyze. Lena versus the microphone. This is really good if you're going to address the silent film era transitioning into the talkies. Is a really good context scene to use. And then obviously you've got Good Morning, which is sort of like the happy-go-lucky, one of the famous songs from the film, which is quite fun and energetic. And it shows like the ridiculousness of the fantasy world of musicals. Okay. So that is the end of Singin' in the Rain. I will do another video very shortly for Grease, and then obviously the rest of the paper. So hopefully that has been useful, and I'm going to finish that there. Thanks.